So thank you for joining us tonight for Permaculture 101. I have been very interested in like organic gardening and things like that, but I have always been a little bit confused as to exactly what permaculture is, so I'm excited about tonight. So Julia Zoltowsky has a bachelor's in environmental studies with a minor in creative writing from Naropa University and has worked with the Chicago Botanic Garden as an assistant horticulturalist. And recently, Julia accepted a position as an allotments and contracts coordinator for the garden's sister organization, Windy City Harvest, which sounds like an awesome job. So very cool. We're very happy to have you here. And I know, Julie, we were thinking about doing an Orchids 101 class, which we'll probably have to bring you back for. But then we switched it to permaculture because I felt like people had maybe a little bit more to learn about that. I'm not sure. But if you would be interested in orchids, let me know in the chat or send me an email. That'd be awesome. So this program is being recorded. So if you need to look back at something, then look forward to an email probably tomorrow with the recording. And yeah, so if you have questions, go ahead and put those in the chat and we will get to those at the end of the program. Okay, all right. So if nothing else, if you don't have any, oh, yes to orchids, okay. If we don't have any urgent questions, I'm going to turn it over to Julia.
Thank you so much for having me today, Jamie, and thanks everybody for joining us tonight. As Jamie mentioned, I work for the Chicago Botanic Garden, and I did take a position as an allotments and contracts coordinator, and that's just a fancy title for community garden organizer. I work on the south and west sides of Chicago with CHA community residents, creating community gardens and supporting them in learning self-sustainable skills. I also do therapeutic horticulture with them. So we do gardening for life enrichment programming for seniors and for children in a couple of wellness centers as well. So I really have been enjoying this new transition, and it has led me to sort of be able to utilize some of these skills that we're going to talk about today. And I hope that we can all learn a couple of things, myself included. So I do have a couple of questions for you all. Feel free to put them in the chat. I'm just wondering, what brought you to this class? Maybe if you are looking for design tips, what kind of landscape you're designing for, or perhaps what you want to learn more about. Maybe that's just like, what the heck is permaculture? So we'll just take a minute there. And it's okay. So I know a lot of the folks, Karen says, I care about the environment, trying to learn more about gardening, designing for a suburban yard, looking for nature-friendly plants. Awesome. Well, these are great things to be thinking about, and a great place to start here. So I'm glad you're all with me today. Ideally Chicagoland native plants, and then Karen also mentioned that they would love to know what they're seeing when they're out walking in the nature. So I think that we can definitely touch on some of these things tonight. So I just want to go over what we'll be kind of talking about today, and what I can set you up for to expect from this. So we're going to talk about how permaculture can be defined and who coined this term, what that even means. We'll also go into the principles of it. So we'll talk about a couple of the fundamental ethics and principles that inform both design choice and just how permaculture can be interpreted. And then from those principles, we'll go into a little bit more detail and look at some inspiration. I'm not going to go too much into like how to set up a rain barrel system or how to design a keyhole garden, but we're going to start talking about what these things are and how you might be able to be inspired by them, and then go out and do your own research for your own area based on the principles, because I think that that's the most important part. You can do all the research that you want to do do to find the native plants that are good for Chicagoland, as well as what are some nature-friendly plants or like pollinator-friendly plants. And that's going to be really determined based on your aesthetic and your desires. So those principles, I think, are the most important part of this entire conversation that we're going to have today. And then at the end, we can talk a little bit more. Maybe there are some stories that people want to share or just other questions that they have about permaculture. And so we can take some time to do that as well. But there's a lot. So I want to just kind of go ahead and get right into it. So permaculture can be broken down into a couple of different ways, permanent culture as well as permanent agriculture. But this term, permaculture, has been defined and redefined by so many different people across the globe based on how it works for their environments. And so basically, and permaculture can also be applied to many different kinds of design processes, not just a suburban landscape or a farmland. It could also be how you design a health center or a children's school, anything like that. So Bill Mollison and Dave Holmgren are the two people that get the most credit for coining this term, which encouraged the gardener to work with nature and to not need to have as much intervention. So not as much use of pesticides or any kind of like weeding. This is very much just like hands-off gardening after you get it started. But there were other people who also invested in this understanding of permaculture. Jesse Bloom and Dave Bollnine are two authors and permaculture practitioners that sum permaculture up as meeting human needs through ecological and regenerative design. And I think that regenerative word is also really, really important and foundational to understanding what permaculture is, because it's not just like putting a raised bed in the ground and getting rid of your grass. It's a lot more. It's how does every design that I implement into this garden benefit everything else around me? So I really like the way that they encapsulate that. And it gives us perspective. It's not a prescription, not one size fits all with permaculture. And it's a combination. So, you can look at it from a sustainable agriculture lens. You can look at it from a landscape design lens. Maybe you're looking at it from an ecological lens. But there's even philosophical and just pure lifestyle lenses to look at this as. And so, again, that's why, as we start discussing the principles and the ethics, I think, really kind of look at which ones attract you the most and how you might be able to just sort of take one principle or one ethic and start to implement that into your everyday life. And I also really want to mention this gentleman here, Masanobu Fukuoka. He was a very big influence to Bill Mollison. He was a scientist who actually gave up all of his research to go live on a farm, and he called it do nothing farming. And so he looked at biological systems that are already in play in the area that he was growing food in, and he asked himself, what can I not do? And through that, Bill Mollison really started to parse out principles of permaculture. So the ethics of permaculture across the board will always look like this. There will always be care for the earth, care for people, and the word fair share can be changed, but the concept is the same, that you're giving away your excess, your surplus, and it's for the benefit of all, not just for the self. When we talk about principles, there are some schools of thought that say that there are 8 permaculture principles, and some schools of thought that say that there are 12 permaculture principles. And so I took the ones that I think are most easily accessible and easily utilized and applied in your day-to-day life. So when we're talking about ethics of permaculture, it really is about the planet and our earth and our landscapes, environments around us. So being mindful of our resources and, looking at degraded land, not as like, oh, we can't use that, that's just ruined, but like as infinite potential to heal and restore. And also it's a very deep understanding that everything is connected in the world. And so our soils, our plants, our air, it's all connected. And when we recognize these things, we can really start to take more care and have more reverence for these processes and these relationships that are inherent. And then you have care for the people. So if we have a healthy earth, then people can be healthy. There are lots of again, schools of thought out there who believe that a lot of the diseases and illnesses that we have are manifest of our unhealthy earth. And so if we're unhealthy, then, we need to take care of the earth so that we can then therefore be healthy as well. And it's about having our needs met, the basic needs, food, shelter, water, and then the rest is just sort of excess to some degree. And then again, this fair share concept is just that, like, grow what you can, not what you want. So it's not about like growing the most fancy, rare cultivar of spinach that doesn't grow in your area. And also, considering how each choice you make has an effect on the larger system. So it's a lot of careful planning, a lot of deep consideration and observation. So now we're going to talk about the principles of permaculture. And like I said, there are varying ideas on which ones are which, but most of the ones that I have here, you'll find in any list that you see on the internet or in a book. Bill Mollison and Dave Holgram have a book called Permaculture. That's like the Bible for a lot of people. And then there are many other resources out there on permaculture design. Jesse Bloom is another one that I would really highly recommend. So the first and most important permaculture principle that I learned, and that I think everyone should learn, no matter if you're trying to change your entire landscape or if you're just experiencing a new place for the first time, it's observing and interacting. So, you want to take notes about your space and see it in all different seasons and learn the patterns of your area. Because, and we're going to talk more about how you might be able to do that, but just sort of getting an idea that, like, you can't plop a garden bed down just anywhere in your backyard or in your front yard. Like, you have to consider which way the sun faces and which way the tree shade is coming in, and the winds, and all these things. And that's why a lot of people end up getting frustrated with their gardens, is because they're not they're just implementing without thought. And so, there's no harm in trying. I'm all about trying new things, but I think it can really save a lot of heartbreak and a lot of hard time if you take some time to observe. And maybe you're not in a space for a whole year, so if you can really just start to do the research of like what the general area is like, that might be helpful. And then another one that I think can be really helpful is catching and storing energy. And this can look like a lot of different things. It can look like, utilizing the resources like, air, water. It can also look like canning your food, recycling, solar panels, aquaponics. I think really, at the basis of it, it's using what you've got available and making sure that you can keep it and that you can, elongate its time. And then obviously another one is that you're going to want to obtain a yield, and that yield can look like a lot of different things, including oxygen, lumber, but it can also be things like education and emotional well-being. What is your goal? What yield are you trying to obtain? And that can really inform what kind of garden you are looking for, what kind of design you're trying to implement. Maybe you really like growing tea, or you really like drinking tea, and it's a really calming thing for you to do. So you make a tea garden and you do all these different designs to promote wellness with pollinator plants that are also tea plants. And they have, I'm getting ahead of myself, but just to kind of hit on that emotional well-being, it really doesn't have to necessarily be for a physical yield. And then the other one is using systems with multiple functions. So that can be your ecological functions, your biological functions, the ones that are living within the landscape. A lot of times we want to like parse everything out and have everything be orderly and by itself, but that's not how nature works. Nature is constantly working together, and no part of the system acts alone. They all act within, together. So when you can notice those systems, and again, we'll talk more about what I mean by that in a little bit more detail. Mimicking nature. So there are a lot of patterns in nature, and not just patterns, but there's functions to those patterns. And I'm not going to get into too much detail there because I have a big component on that, which I think is really fun. When you start, somebody mentioned, I want to know what I'm seeing when I'm walking in nature. I think this is going to really open your eyes to seeing nature in a new way when we talk about mimicking nature. Then you want to use and value diversity. A lot of agriculture is monocropping, and that leads to soil degradation. But when you start looking at biodiversity and cultural diversity, you really start to see how you can build resilience within an ecological landscape. And I think that that's important because when you start to see forests that are overgrown with one species, a wildfire can be really helpful, but also sometimes we need to have interventions so that those areas can reacclimate and reassess how they work together. Otherwise, you start to lose really beautiful and unique species. So you want to use edges. And when I say edges, I mean in every sense of the word. You want to make use of all your spaces, including the edges of one cultural group and another. Perhaps you're living in an area where there are different communities around you and you want to create and collaborate with them. You have to kind of play to those edges. And it helps decrease problem edges. When you start to notice the beneficial ones, you can start to creatively think about, oh, well, that border over there really blocks my sun from this garden. You can start to see how that might actually be a benefit to you in a different way. And then we have designing for resilience. And I think that this is another big one. You're not just designing for your own pleasure right here and right now, but you're designing for future generations. And you're also honoring past generations, people who steward these lands before we did, or people who have used these lands for other things. We can learn from how they've utilized the space and how we might want to utilize the space moving forward and who we might be designing these spaces for in the future. It's also looking at closed loop systems with backup plans and using renewable resources. It's really just considering every small detail. And through those concepts, like just those principles alone, you can really start to understand how to creatively use and respond to change. But this is a foundational principle too, and sometimes what worked one season doesn't necessarily work in other seasons. So we have to constantly be adapting to these patterns that are shifting. And we have to relinquish control. I think that can be a really hard thing for a lot of people. Being a horticulturalist myself and having, people have high standards of how a display garden should look. Sometimes we do have to just relinquish control when a disease wipes out a whole crop or a whole plant that we were going to put in our annual designs. We don't always have full control over everything. And I think that a big one that I learned from my teachers is that the problem is the solution. So if you're noticing a problem, the solution is probably pretty close by or within that system. I think a lot about that in the form of like nature itself. Poison ivy, people can get burned and get really bad rashes from poison ivy. And there's a plant that grows next to poison ivy called jewelweed. And jewelweed is really good for relieving the rashes and the reactions that people get from poison ivy. So sometimes the problem can be the solution. It's pretty close by, at the very least. And it can be really exciting to start thinking about these ideas and these concepts and these principles, and you might want to like go all out and all in. And I highly recommend that you start slow and you start small, with little tiny moments and movements forward to a larger vision. Because if you know, go all in, and you put a lot of money into it and a lot of time, and things don't work out, and you don't have like those moments of transition where you can, you know, readjust or adapt if needed be, you've put a lot of effort into something that now you have to scrap and start over. So you want to avoid a quick payoff and immediate fix. Those things in general, my dad always said, you're the instant gratification generation, and I've really tried hard not to live in that world, because it's the slow and steady wins the race. So those were the principles. And now we're going to talk a little bit more deeply on how we can use these principles to inform our designs. So the first one we talked about was observing and interacting. And we talked a little bit about, you know, ideally a year worth of observation is going to be the best bet to successfully understand how the different parts of your home and your yard or your area, your space, whatever, works, what's happening in it. But other ways that you can do that is by making base maps, and I have some examples of base maps here in a moment, as well as learning your climate and your ecological context. So permaculture avoids annuals at all costs, because they don't work in an environment for an extended period of time. So you're really kind of looking at more permanent solutions. Catching and storing energy can also look like rain barrels and berms, as well as swales, and I will go into a little bit more details of what a berm and a swale is. But compost can also be a way to catch and store energy. And I've said closed loop systems a couple of times now, but what a closed loop system is that like you've created a cyclical relationship where nothing is coming out of the system, and nothing is coming in. You put things in to begin with, but then as it, you know, perpetuates itself, it stops needing to have energy put into it. So a compost system, a compost bin is not an ideal closed loop system, but it is one factor of a potential closed loop system where you're growing food, you're using that food, you're using the waste to make compost to then go into your garden again. That is a small example of what a closed loop system could look like. Some people say that there's no true closed loop system. I think if we can try to get as close to that as possible, we're on the right track. So mimicking nature really always excites me, because there are different patterns that you can utilize for planting. Things like herb spirals are a really great and easy way to just start growing. You know, if you want to practice permaculture principles or just like getting a fresh idea, herb spirals are really cool. And I have some examples of that as well. You can also do things like creating a guild, and I have some examples of that. But you're always looking for biodiversity. Nature is not a monoculture, it's a polyculture. It's a bunch of relationships all intermingling together. And you want to definitely consider the systems thinking. So stacking functions, and I'll get into a little bit more detail what stacking functions is, but basically it's understanding that one plant, like if you choose one plant, that plant probably has multiple functions. And then you can put another plant that also helps with other functions. And so you're just kind of combining these, you know, either concepts like compost or a rain barrel with plants that also catch water or hold and store more water. And you also want to just look at your surrounding ecosystem and what's already there and how might you be able to support it more fully or mimic it as well. So for observing and interacting, you definitely want to do like a soil test. I think soil testing is really good. I say that even in like my small gardening and backyard classes, because if you know your soil, you know what you're lacking and you know what you need to add. Some other things that are really important, I think, is what directions is the sun at any point during the day? Do you have slopes? What's your altitude? Is there a watershed nearby? What's already growing here? That'll be a really good indicator of what you might be able to grow in that area. You want to look at your microclimates. And so a microclimate is like you have your backyard, but you also have a garage, and the garage at midday casts a shadow from the sun onto your area. So those plants don't get full sun, but all the rest of the garden does. That's a microclimate. And then you also want to look at what your resources already are, and what your edges already are. So with your edges is like, is there fencing? Do you have neighbors? Is there a vacant lot, water, a sidewalk? Any different ecosystem or climate little shift is an edge to some degree. And as far as resources, like what energy can you capture and store with little to no intervention? So is there already a pond there? Can you just like add a little bit more plants around it to kind of keep that water in there? Or is there some swales already or some berms, and might you be able to use those to design with? And again, can they serve multiple functions? Probably, and you'll be able to see that soon. I think that this is a really beautiful example too of like how to visualize how you'll interact with your property or your like design. And there's two different ways of looking at it. So permaculture looks at zones. And so you have your home or your city, and that's the zone 0. And then you go outward from those zones, and they're, basically the most visited to the most unvisited or most unfrequently visited. So, on the left here, it's you have your kitchen garden, and then as you go out, you've got maybe like your fruit production, and then you've got like a fruit pasture, and then you've got your wild, maybe you have your animals living out there. It's a place where you really don't go out that often, and you don't need to do any work at. And then as the farthest zone out is like the wild, the wilderness. It's a place where you go to source inspiration, maybe meditate, forage for some of those more wild things that you're not cultivating in your own gardens. And so when you look at the right side, you kind of see the same thing. It's like every day I'm in my home, and then every day I go out into my kitchen garden and I cut my herbs for my dinner. And then you have your visit occasionally. So I go out to my orchards and I take care of my animals like every other day. And so on and so forth. So that's kind of a way to start looking at how you would, put things in your home, or put things in your, where you would place things in your design concept. And then I talked about base maps, and this is like a really, 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 they can be really simple as far as like where the sun is, and like where your house is, and where there's shade. This is like a really helpful and simple design. Or it can be really, really elaborate, where you have, your concepts of the greenhouse and the water, and you've got every little detail. This is a really beautiful like food forest mandala that they have going on here. If you can see with my clicker. And so it can be as like, simple or as complex as you want it to be. But knowing, your zones and your sectors, or like where you want to place things, can help you. And it can also help you kind of track those different shifts in the seasonal patterns as you move through the year. And then these are examples of edges. So you have these there's a sidewalk and a pathway, and like all these gardens are just right up on the edge, so that people are interacting with them on a daily basis as they're walking through. And then on the right, you've got curved edges, and this has multiple principles acting here. They're not monocultures. There's polycultures here, and this curved sort of pattern is both aesthetically pleasing, but it also serves to maximize space. Instead of straight lines, you can add extra to some degree. So then we have, we move on to catching and storing energy. So creating microclimates, you can identify the microclimates that you have in the area, but then you can also create ones if you don't have them, or if the ones you have are not ideal for you, if you don't want to work with them. You can make things like greenhouses, or utilize hoop housing. a lot of times, you know, at the fruit and vegetable garden, Jamie, we were talking earlier about any permaculture principles that I might see there. They use their walls to do like espaliers and to climb and trellis things. And like that's one way that they create, they utilize microclimates because the heat from the brick keeps them warm throughout the year. And then they also can just sort of branch out, and it has an aesthetic function as well. Composting and building soil are really important as well. Composting is not always people's first choice. It can be messy, it can be stinky, it's a lot of work. It takes a little bit of science as well, but that's just one way. Building soil can also look like worm compost or adding animals like chickens to your area. It can also look like utilizing perennial plants, or even looking at bioaccumulation. So those are using different plants that add nutrients to the soil. And then you have, you know, rain barrels, water cisterns, and ponds. There's also things like compost toilets, gray water systems. You can do things like make a rain garden. And then the idea of using ambient water, which is just using water that already exists in the area. So these are berms and then swales. So your berm is a raised sort of, you know, bed, if you will, that you can put plants into, and then the divot or that little ditch sort of area would be a swale, and those areas catch more water. So the plants that you're putting in the berm are ones that you don't want to have a lot of water. So squash is a good one because you don't really want, squash gets a lot of rot, and if they get rot, then they get squash beetles, and it's just a nasty vicious cycle. So having them raised and then having something that can kind of suck up the water pretty quickly is a great function. And then they also have like a trellis over here with some beans growing. So this is just one concept. And then they also have the bales of like hay, which is another moisture wicking solution, and they probably use it, it's reused from their bedding and the animals that the animals have. And then we also have greenhouses. These are like window boxes that vegetable, we got some, you know, lettuces growing in. The vegetable garden also has this at their in their island over there. And then this is an example, this tree is an example of an espalier, utilizing the wall as a microclimate. So these are just some other ideas and inspiration for how you might be able to just implement some of these concepts into your own home and your own backyard. So building your soil can really be as easy as knowing which plants will add what nutrients to your garden. And there are tons of resources out there. I don't give an exhaustive list because, you know, you really want to go in and get your soil tested so you know what nutrients your soil is lacking, and then that will help determine what plants you might need. And then, you know, you can look up resources like bioaccumulating plants or phosphorus you know, depositing plants or nitrogen depositing plants. I think that all of the concepts that we're talking about now can be in both your front and backyard as well. You know, again, it's just recognizing what microclimates, what where the sun is, and what shade structures might be around. That can also help your front yard as well. And then you really just want to bring the soil to life. I live in Chicago. It's really, really clay heavy soil. It's really clay heavy soil all over this area. So we got to break that clay soil down and bring in the nutrients from nitrogen fixers and plants who bring in biomass, and then ones who also suck up particularly harmful nutrients from the soil. All of these things combined with adding worms or adding compost will help really build your soil. It takes thousands of years for any of the soil that we have that exists to exist. And so we really want to keep that, because the more that we're using pesticides and chemicals and oil, the more we're stripping our lands of their nutrients, and it's going to be really difficult for things to grow. So we got to keep building that soil, I think, first and foremost, healthy soil. So I do talk a little bit about like what kind of plants you can think about based on what you might be needing in your backyard or your front yard or just your area in general. So you have mulch makers. Those are ones that are going to make green manure. They're likely going to be cover crops. You've got nutrient accumulators. Those are plants that draw specific nutrients up from the soil. So plants that might draw up nitrogen are plants that you might not want if you need a lot of nitrogen in your soil. Vice versa, there might be plants that suck up a lot of lead. That might be a plant you really do want in your backyard because you don't really want a whole lot of lead in your backyard. We also have nitrogen fixers, which they basically, through bacteria and fungi in their roots, make nitrogen in their bioavailable form. You've got soil fumigants and pest repellents. And while they're not as well researched, this is, an example would be like marigolds repel pests and calendula attract this. They're companion plants or plants that might, in large quantities or in their like most uncultivated form, provide benefits, but not as much research in that regard. Then you have things like insectary plants, and these are plants that are like your pollinator friendly plants, but they're also plants that will help both with the host, so the larva part of the plant, but then also so like in the concept of like a butterfly, you have the caterpillar and then you have the butterfly. You want a plant for the caterpillar and you want plants for the butterfly. And you also want plants for a bunch of other insects that are going to be attracted to your garden. Then there are plants that have spike roots. These are oftentimes perennials. A lot of prairie plants have spike roots, and this is basically just plants that break up the soil. Their roots are so strong and go so deep into the soil. They're constantly aerating and moving the soil around to just kind of really bring out the nutrients and the biomass that's there. And then you have wildlife nurturers. And these are plants that are going to attract and protect wildlife. So they could be like your evergreens are really great for the migratory birds or the birds that you have year round. They could also be great for other animals and insects. And then you have things that are called shelter belters. And these are plants that are going to they have multiple functions. They can be windbreak plants, but they can be like your privacy screen. And those shelter belters could also be wildlife nurturers, and they could be insectary plants, and they might even be mulch makers because their needles will drop, and that can be helpful for the soil as well. And I just have a couple of soil building plants for you. So we've got yarrow, lupin, alfalfa, red clover, and stinging nettle. And these are all bioaccumulators. And these are just ones that I really like that grow well here. Yarrow in particular has many beautiful colors and also has it's insect attracting. So you have a couple of functions there as well. And red clover is another one. Red clover is very well, and yarrow and red clover both are very medicinal plants, as well as stinging nettle. And so you have medicinal qualities to it. You've got insect attracting qualities to it, and then you also have bioaccumulation qualities. So that's an example of stacking functions right there. And so the other ways to build soil is through sheet mulching. Maybe composting is not your game or your jam. You can do sheet mulching, which is like taking cardboard and then green cuttings like from your grass, and then a layer of like newspaper or like shredded material, and then a layer of like wood chips, and then your soil. That could be, and then you just keep doing that. And they call that lasagna mulching or sheet mulching. And then alternatively, vermicompost or worm composting is another really exciting and fun way that you might want to explore building your soil. A little bit more nuanced, composting has a lot of science to it. Vermicomposting has even more science to it because now you're working with a living organism that requires certain things and does not like other things. Like you can't put onions in there. There's a lot of things you can't. So oftentimes people who are really into compost will also vermicompost to kind of balance balance what their output might be. You know, I was doing compost for a while in my old place. We had 11 garden beds, and we had a small compost like tumbler, and the amount of output like compost that I had to put into the bin to tumble was too much. So we had to start sheet mulching, and we would just like do a layer of cardboard, and then we would do the chicken bedding and stuff, and we put that down so it had the chicken you know, poop in it. And then we would do whatever like weeds and other things that we had in the garden. And we just sort of layered that. And that area actually has turned out really nicely. So, and then, you know, this little thing in the background, healthy soils, healthy food, healthy people, healthy planet. I think that, you know, when you start really thinking about how things layer, it really does start with the soil. So these are some examples of water storage and also like ambient water inclusion. So this is where noticing your property and noticing different aspects of your property can come in handy, because these are obviously like on the right, you have ambient water. This area gets flooded, and then you have this, you know, huge puddle. And maybe that's not great for, you know, the whatever animals might be living there, might start getting more mosquitoes, and then, you know, there's a lot of things that might not be great about that. But if you start to see that area as potential and then build upon it, you can really start creating a really amazing ecosystem that benefits you and the rest of the environment, and utilizes that space. Whereas on the left-hand side, this is more an intentional, implemented, where they've got like berms and then little waterways. And this is a larger project that is just starting to come in. You know, this is like right as it started being planted. I'm not a huge proponent of wood chips per se, but they do work well when you're starting to like make your berms and your swales. And then this is like high end, also could be a permaculture concept, you know, instead of like hostas and pine trees, you could have other you know, medicinal plants or water loving plants that also provide food for other birds and insects and things like that. So this is my favorite part, is the patterns in nature. So there are infinite patterns in nature that are replicated in our bodies and outside our bodies. And I think that that is super beautiful. And when we recognize those patterns, when we identify them, you can start to recognize them everywhere. And then furthermore, you can see the value of those functions, why they exist. So there are fractals, branching, waves, meanders, grids, networks, tessellations, and spirals. These are a couple of ways to look at it, but you've got fractals. So you've got like Romanesco on the one side, and then a little cactus on the other side, a little succulent on the other side. These are fractals that exist in nature naturally. Nobody genetically modified them to exist this way. That's just how they exist. And then we have got branching patterns. And I guess to back up a second, not only are there patterns in nature, but with patterns in nature, there's also something called the doctrine of signatures. And this is more of an herbalism concept to some degree, but I think it also bears mentioning here in this moment, is that so a lot of times a plant will display certain qualities that indicate what it might be good for. So an example of like a branching plant that is good. So there's elderberry. Elderberry is a branching plant, and the way that the elderberries grow is they look like lungs. And when you look at your lungs, they're branching. They have a branching look to them. The veins and all the arteries and things like that have a branching look to them. So there's an indication that elderberry is good for the lungs, and that's actually very true. It's a big one that people use when they have respiratory upset. So, you know, there's really like that. When I first learned that, it really blew my mind to just like see nature in this new way, where it's like getting me curious about, well, if that plant looks like that, then what might it be good for? What other things does it relate to? So these are just some of the ways. Branching, then you have waves, the waves of mushrooms, their little gills, literal waves, meandering sort of rivers. You've got spirals. Perhaps you're familiar with the Fibonacci sequence, that perfect spiraling outward. That's seen in a lot of different ways. And then the one that I really like the most, because it seems almost unnatural, like especially the beehives to some degree, but they're very like natural, replicable patterns in nature. So you've got grids, networks, and tessellations. And so when you start to see these patterns as you walk through nature, as you just experience life, you can start to see how those systems, those patterns might play a role in how you design your backyard, your front yard, your area, your space. So some design concepts to use that sort of mimic patterns in nature. We talked about herb spirals earlier. I think that's a really big one where you're utilizing both height and space. And it doesn't have to be just for herbs. It can be for a lot of different things. It's been called herb spiral. There's also keyhole gardening, which uses designs for ease of access and harvest. You can utilize spacing and plant choice to mimic your grids and your matrix, especially with like circle gardens, and definitely emphasizing perennials. And then guilds is it's combining plants that work with each other. So again, thinking about those bioaccumulators, those mulch makers, the plants that work together to create better systems. And I have a little bit more detail on that in here in a second. So here's some herb spiral examples. They're helpful to create shade, especially when you're looking at this. If you start from the north side at the bottom and you move up, you can sort of see how the microclimates change from wet loving species to dry loving species as you get higher up. So some ideal bottom plants might be like mints and chamomile, but remember, you're just looking for plants that really enjoy moisture and shade. And then the middle plants can, be anything like lemon balm or basil, violet, and you just want to make sure that they can tolerate some heat. And then the drought plants are most suited for the top. And then this is another example. It's individual pots, but the way that they're placed creates a microclimate. Putting them close together like that also creates a microclimate and a design. So, it doesn't have to be so complex, or like you don't have to start from scratch. You can kind of see what you've already been working with and how you can just sort of rearrange it to just be a little bit more easy. And then top plants, like marjoram, rosemary, sage, again, things that are a little bit more dry. So this little animated image on the left is showing a bear actually digging a hole with another person digging as well. And I show this picture not only because it's a very cute one, but because this person is they're growing in a bed, not a very raised bed, but a bed nonetheless. And she's in the middle of the bed and she's cultivating all around her. But what she's doing is she's also compacting the soil while she's, trying to till the rest of it. So two things she's doing. She's tilling the soil, which I would never do. I would just add new soil to it, or seed a cover crop or something, so that the good nutrients stay in the soil. And then also I would do something like on the right here, which is a keyhole gardening, which, you can come in, you can harvest from all sides, and you can actually go out and harvest the rest. If she tries to maximize that entire space, she's going to have a hard time getting into the middle of that garden bed. It's not going to be as easy for her. So I definitely really, if you're going to go the route of raised beds, an herb spiral is a good one. I think keyhole gardening is another good one. Some people also call it mandala planting, because you can incorporate it into like more of a circle. And I have some other examples I can show you here in a second. So these are some other ones. So you have the pathway, and then you can come in. So this is an herb garden right here. This is like a planting bed, and then you go around and that's all planted. Like all the green spaces around all of these are planted, and then the tan is the pathways. So these are just different designs that maximize space. And you can see this particular one says the percent of reachable space as well as the plantable space. So this top one here is 88% plantable, but only 55% reachable. This middle one here is 84% plantable, but 66% reachable. So it's a little bit more reachable. And then this one, which you would think is like pretty complex and like maybe not the most reachable, actually is 80% plantable, but 72% reachable. So this is actually the most accessible garden design. And these are all keyhole gardening concepts. So this is just another way to look at how you might want to set up your garden beds if you're just going to, take anything from it and you're like, well, I can only make a garden bed because I have a small space. This might be your best bet on how to utilize the most of that. And this is just another kind of design. This is a house right here that leads, from the back door straight out into the garden. They come in and they can harvest all of these. There's also another one. I've seen ones where it's like the driveway, and then as soon as the person gets out of the driveway, they have to go through their garden to get into their home. And so that like forces them to not only like stop, take pause, enjoy their garden, but then they get their fresh produce for the day and they know they're inspired by what they're going to eat and they've taken a moment to take a breath. And I think that that can be really valuable, especially in this day and age. And then guilds. So guilds are another really exciting thing that I like to talk about because they're utilizing multiple functions, and you can create whole forests and whole like ecosystems just by looking at a guild system. And the most common one that people know is the Three Sisters, which was an indigenous guild that was made and utilized all across North America and in other areas. But it's corn, squash, and beans, and the corn is the like trellis, and the beans crawl up the corn, and they fix nitrogen, so which helps the corn to grow because the corn takes a lot of nutrients up. And then the squash kind of goes around to save any soil from being stripped away, and also cools the ground around it, so it kind of keeps the water there. And then you have things like a fruit tree guild over here, which has a couple of different things, including like rose and wild garlic and apple trees. You can really look at guilds in a lot of different ways. You can look at community function guilds, so grouping all of the species that do a specific job. You can also do like mutual support guilds where each plant is complementary to one another. There could be ones that are like resource partitioning, which you are combining plants that they're complementary to each other, but more importantly, they provide resources to one another. So the Three Sister Guild is an example of resource partitioning, whereas like a mutual support guild would be like taking away the squash and just having the beans and the corn. They're complementary to one another, but they don't necessarily completely provide resources to one another. And then you have super guilds, which are multiple guilds built around each other, as a blueprint for a food forest. There's a lot of different ways. So this over here is another example of the Three Sisters Guild. They have sunflowers here as well. And then you have like an orchard guild, which are some common ones. A lot of people look at food forests as guilds. And then here's some other examples. And you're looking at, how does this help all aspects? It all starts with the tomato in the middle. That's the plant, that's the anchor plant. And then you have ground covers and understories and shrubs and herbaceous plants, and they all kind of work together to help one another. And then this is another example of an apple tree guild. The apple tree is the anchor. So when you're thinking about how to design a guild, you're thinking about what is the plant that is going to be the central basis? What am I going to be anchoring in and then building out upon if you're thinking about making guilds? And then you could even go as far as making like a whole tree guild. And this is a really cool, I love oak trees. I think they're so beautiful, and you can do an oak tree with wild ginger and strawberries and hazel, and you can have all kinds of food just in this little oak guild. I say little, it's not little, it's really big. And so here's that kind of concept that we were talking about, the little bees with their honeycombs. This is like matrix planting. So you're utilizing the most amount of space by planting in these sort of hexagonal ways. So at the edges and in the center, and then they eventually grow to be these huge heads of lettuce. This is a monoculture, so I wouldn't necessarily suggest this, but I'm just to show an example of what that looks like. You're going to be able to maximize the most amount of space. This is an example of a polyculture. So you've got your marigolds, your basil, your Swiss chard, your cosmos. You got a couple of other things. I think these are like geraniums right here. Some lupines in the back. You could also look at companion planting as a way to, do your designs as far as building your guilds or your resilience goes. Crop rotation, again, that's going to be like, not everything works every season, and to keep using the same things is going to deplete your soil. There's vertical growing that you can do, so utilizing spaces, your walls, your balconies, your stairways. And I think at the end of the day, permaculture, as I've said many times, just really focuses on perennial plants that provide multiple services. So like asparagus, it's a perennial plant. It provides food. It provides shelter for other animals, for like the swallowtails and the other butterflies. It's a great food for them to have. So this is, that's one of the plants that I would recommend. This is another example of a polyculture interplanting. You've got your cabbage with your amaranth and your marigolds. And marigolds and calendula, I think this is calendula actually, is really great at attracting aphids. And aphids are notorious to infest brassicas, cabbage, kale, broccoli. It really just is, it can really definitely just be detrimental to them. So planting calendula around them really attracts the aphids. And so that's another way that you might be able to mitigate things instead of using pesticides and things like that. So again, you want to look at systems thinking, really consider the cold winter climate reality, and consider plants that will overwinter and keep building your soil year after year, so you're not buying new plants and replacing things. Really do your research on, maybe that pine tree is really beautiful, but it's actually not cold hardy here. And so you spent lots of money on it and then died. And consider that we live in a city. So a lot of us, I don't know, maybe not, that's an assumption, but small space gardening seems to be where a lot of people go. So you don't have to have a huge property for a lot of these concepts to be implemented and applied. These are some other examples, again, of polycultures and interplanting, and using the edges. And again, with stacking functions, you're looking at as you see all these concepts sort of building on one another, and you're looking at your space in this new light, and you're seeing all the patterns in nature, you can start to see even just how the plants can find their own roles, and you'll start to see how you'll not have to be as like in the garden as possible, and maybe that's something that you want. So maybe you don't go entirely hands off. There'll always be something to do in the garden, but the whole point is that these plants are working together, so you don't have to do as much work. So there are things like nurse plants, so plants that will help other plants grow. They'll protect those little baby plants from getting eaten by birds, or the seedlings to get pulled out by whoever. Water features, privacy screens. These are all ways that you can sort of work together to, like the privacy screens in particular, one can, offer you the privacy that you're looking for, but it also can be a windbreak, which allows your area to experience less of that cold damage that might be happening during the winter times. So we live in a short season, we've got poor soil. So, you want to be looking at plants that grow 120 days or sooner. Getting rid of the lawn definitely is like the first step in a lot of people's minds. But I would say, you can start just taking out little chunks of your lawn. But first and foremost, you want to just consider the short growing season we have. Root crops are probably going to be your best bet because they can get stored for all over winter. They're both spring and fall, so you can have multiple harvests. You want to be trapping heat. So you want to utilize things like your hoop houses, your cold frames, and building shelters are going to protect you from those wind and the frosts. And knowing where your hot spots are and where your cold spots are. You can plant things that could be indicator plants. So if you have a plant that is supposed to be tolerant to, whatever our zone is, you can see if that plant fares during the winter season. And if it doesn't fare, then that's an indicator plant that shows you that that spot is a little bit colder than even what our zone is. And so you might need to find something that's a zone above that to really fit into that area. Same thing with the hot. You want to look at plants that are supposed to be drought tolerant and use that as a test pilot. So start out small. So if you're going to rip out your lawn, maybe don't rip out your whole lawn yet and just like cut out a corner of your lawn and test out a few things there and see what works and what doesn't. And then you can sort of slowly build upon that. You can also look at things like square foot gardening. So again, you use the keyhole designs or the mandala planting designs, and you just take every square foot and you utilize all of it. This is a method that, so every square foot has multiple plants within it. It's not just like every square foot is a different plant. It's like within 1 square foot, there's 4 different plants or 7 different plants, relatively speaking. Then you can also utilize parking strips. So somebody was talking about their front yard. So I've always known the parking strips as hell strips or the right of way. They're really hot. They're really, oftentimes filled with garbage and dirty. But a lot of people are trying to utilize them. Maybe in some areas there's some trees. You can definitely, look at those spots as potential areas to grow, and then also to connect to people, right? Like you are growing in your front yard, vegetables or something, and people are like, what, you grow vegetables in your front yard? This is so cool. And then you can start having a conversation. There's a person in the neighborhood who's got chickens in the front yard, and I was like, that's crazy, you got to take the chickens in the front yard. But like they have conversations with people all the time about their chickens, and it's just a really great way to connect. So your front yard has a lot of potential too, and maybe it's maybe your front yard is not like on your property but the other side of it. And so there are some things to consider. It's technically not yours, so the city can come in and do some things to it. You want to make sure that there's not any like piping or electrical or anything like that, so definitely need to call before you start digging. But these spaces can be utilized, and people do utilize them, and I think that's a really great way to engage with your community. And then you can do things like biointensive planting. So you can double dig. So you dig deep enough to add compost, and then you put the plant on top of the compost, and then you cover your plant. And this is supposed to produce higher yields. And so that's kind of what that biointensive planting is, especially because we have such a short growing season. You want to get a jump start. So on the left here, this is one example. They use 1 species per square foot, 1 crop per square foot, but I would and have done like 2 to 4 crops per square foot. And then this is another example of that. These are strawberries. This is another example of, and then this is an example of the parking strips or the health strips that I was talking about. This is like very much an annual, more of like a display and less of permaculture, but I'm just trying to show this as an example of what you could possibly do with your the front space that you have. You could use this to grow vegetables, to have a chicken coop, to grow some fruit trees if you wanted, to build a couple of guilds. The opportunities are endless. And then this is like an example of, there's berms here. And then there's this walkway. So like not all permaculture designs look as fluid or as interconnected as others. And that just again is based on like what the yield you're trying to obtain. Are you trying to obtain more of an aesthetic concept? Are you trying to obtain an emotional well-being? Are you trying to obtain food? What is it? So when you're thinking about aesthetic, you can also think about themes and repetition. So you're wanting to definitely create unity and cohesion. And this is usually done with like creating your guilds and planting styles, as well as using plants that can function in several different areas in the garden. So then you're connecting them to different areas. So you can have a couple of oak trees if you have a bigger property, and these oak trees can act as shade, and they can act as food, and they can act as shelter, and they can act as a lot of different things, and they balance. So you also want to consider using appropriate size and considerations for your full maturity of your plants, as well as the long-term effects. Some plants will, again, like leach a lot of nutrients out of the soil, but they won't live very long. So then they're really beneficial for a moment, but then you have to consider what are you going to put there next, or what can grow after that plant is done for the season, what's going to come up afterwards. Just so seasonal interest or seasonal functionality. Color is another one. You know, dark colors are going to hide imperfections, light colors are the most attractive. This is more so in the sense of like well-being and emotional well-being and just like aesthetic design in general. But also like dark colors are going to be, they're going to be quicker to dry out. Light colors are going to fade quicker. And then you also have to consider just like what are you attracting? And then I really like anytime I'm doing a design, I'm trying to create connections, and I'm trying to use the plants to tell a story, specifically like a story, whether it's for me or my clients or the garden where I design for, you know, those are the areas that I'm trying to tell the story. So I think that that can be a fun and creative way to really kind of get your mind moving on how you want to use plants. And so these are just another couple of examples. You know, it can look real wild and rugged. You got chickens running around everywhere. And it can look really neat and really clean and fully edged and functional. So it's really a matter of up to you. This is a middle ground for me. You know, they've got their compost, they've got like their sheds, they've got some raised beds, they've got some interplantings around. This is like their little grazing area. So they've got a lot of stuff going on there. It's a little cleaner. And then these are just some references that I really wanted to just share with you. You know, I would say that Toby Hemingway's This Guy's Garden and Graham Bell, The Permaculture Garden, both of these books are what I used when I was taking my design course. I received my certificate from Naropa University, so I did study permaculture and had to like make a whole design and implement it. It took a year, and there are a lot of different courses that you can take, mini courses, 3-month courses, hands-on, online only. So if this is something that you're interested in, you want to like practice more and like learn more specifically, like how do I build a swale, or like how do I make a rain barrel system? These books can show you that, as well as like any of the courses you decide to look up. So I feel like I was really worried that I was gonna run out of time while presenting that, but that was my presentation. So I'm glad I got through all of it. Now we can answer some questions if we want.
Well, yeah, that was great. So I'm just wondering, why are you not a proponent of wood chips?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I'm not a proponent of wood chips because oftentimes when you buy wood chips, they're coming from all different sources outside of your local ecosystem. So unless you have the privilege of mulching your own wood chips, you don't know where they're coming from. And furthermore, when they break down, they create a lot of you know, mycorrhizal fungi growth, the mycelium. And so not all fungal growth is good. And that's why I just try to avoid it, because it can really absorb too much moisture and then, you know, perpetuate disease. So I avoid that.
And I did see another question in the chat there from Robert. Any suggestions for guild planting pawpaw for Chicagoland.
Yeah. So I think I'm going to just go back to my slide really quickly because I'm almost positive that I had a guild with pawpaw in it. Yes. So pawpaw is real fun. I love growing pawpaw. And I think some really great ones to go along with it would be like gooseberries and currants. There's a couple of different currants that grow well here, as well as wild ginger, and then comfrey. Comfrey is a medicinal plant. Wild ginger you can eat. Gooseberry you can eat. They're good plants for foraging, for other species to come and enjoy and live in. So it's definitely you're looking at like more shrub-like, berry-like plants will be helpful. And then you could probably put a couple of flowers in there too if you want. I think comfrey's got a really beautiful purple flower that would look really nice. So those are just some examples that I've got.
So, yeah, there's just so much information. It's if there's like one thing that we should be taking away from this program, what do you think it would be?
Yeah. I think that, you're right. There is a lot of information. It can be really overwhelming. And I think that what was always encouraging for me from the get-go was to just start looking at my environment with a lot of curiosity, and just noticing those little things, noticing the shift in the day or the branching pattern of the oak tree. I think just like really seeing those can inspire us, can calm us, and can also just like really reinvigorate us to seeing the potential. And so when we start to notice those things, when we start to get inspired by that, we can really be motivated to see other things and start maybe considering these other aspects that I touched on briefly today.
Awesome. And I thank you for kind of encouraging us to be patient with getting rid of the entire lawn. I know that's my goal, but it's, yeah,
Yeah.
just baby steps, right?
Yeah. And I mean, and there's nothing wrong. Like if you want to rip your whole lawn out, go for it. I would worry that you'd have like a really bare lawn or like a really bare area and just not have a lot of beauty coming up so quickly. And like I said, it is just always nice to try small. But I'm all about abolishing the lawns. They're awful. We shouldn't have them. I don't know why they exist,
I
but
agree. Yeah. All right. Well, I don't see any more questions. This was great, super informative, and I'm hoping that everyone that was watching tonight is encouraged to step out there and just have some fun, right?
yeah, thank you all so much. I really do love teaching this course, and I wish that I could, expand upon everything so much more, but it would take a long time. So thanks for sticking around for these brief concepts. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, hopefully we can see you soon.
Yes, thank you
All
all.
right.
Have a good night.
Thanks.